Good day. So previously I discussed discovery and what it takes to do a good discovery with Odoo, or really with any ERP. First is asking a ton of questions, and then thinking about how the answers will apply in Odoo. So then I started to work on step 2, solution design. And I did the classic walk around the cul-de-sac, but by the time I was done talking and walking, it was over 7 minutes of content. So I decided to do a fancy deck here, it's not very fancy, and go through the sub-steps involved in solution design. So let's do that. All right, so the first step is to review everything you did in discovery. So review the questions that you went through, any thoughts on how things are probably going to work with Odoo, what modules are probably going to be used. So review all of that discovery in planning for the next step of implementation. Then the next thing is to specifically review all of the many Odoo modules and see if those, as a default, can work with this implementation. And you also want to look at third-party apps, of which there are thousands. And the goal here is to try to find as many fits, basic fits, as you can. And keeping in mind, you've got access to all 80 plus of those applications. So there probably is a basic fit for much of what you're looking for. Then you're going to start to think about, is customization going to be needed? And there's a conversation here that we're going to get into in the remaining steps. But the goal is to not have to customize as a default, right? To think about, okay, well, these 80 modules sewn together, as Odoo typically does sew them together to automate and have workflows, will they work as is? And then think about that. If you do find them, then think about the conversation with the client over where there might not be an exact fit, but can you walk through the workflow in Odoo to convince them that it will work with the default Odoo modules? Because things get more hairy, somewhat more hairy after that. All right, so let's imagine that you are going to need some level of customization. So the first step of understanding that is realizing that the standard version of Odoo, which is, so there's two versions, standard and custom. The standard version will not work if you're going to do any customization at all. Customization being moving a field on a screen or adding a new field on a screen. That is essentially a customization. So standard is on a shared cloud environment, and custom is not. So let's imagine for this conversation that we're talking past standard and you're going to be doing some form of custom. So the next step is to question, what level of custom am I going to need? Because you can with the basic custom functionality, the basic custom version, use Odoo's Studio feature. So Odoo Studio feature is a really cool feature that allows basic customization to be done without any programming needed. You can add some programming in with Studio, but you don't have to. So Studio is used for adding new fields, moving fields around or hiding fields on screen, doing automations, or you can actually create an entirely new Odoo module that is a custom module. And all of that using Studio is not considered a true customization because that is all still built in to the live version of your file. So that means that you don't have to worry about using GitHub or using staging branches. You can have those and do Studio functionality in staging branches if you want to, but you don't have to. Doing it in staging branches makes it easier to back out of the things that you do in Studio, for sure. So that's something to keep in mind, but it also makes things way more complex in terms of knowing GitHub, knowing how to work with staging branches, all of those things. So it's kind of crazy, and I'll definitely have a separate video related to the idea that when you're using Studio in your live file, it literally is that. You are doing live development, and relatively safely. But that's another video. All right, moving on. So if you do realize that, no, the Studio functionality that I just described is not going to be enough, and the requirements of the customer's customizations are significant enough that we are going to have to do custom development using Odoo's development functionality, which involves knowing Python. It involves using Odoo's cloud environment, OdooSH, or there are third-party cloud environments you can use. It involves using GitHub, and it involves using staging branches. All of those things you're going to need to know about and understand. There's plenty of videos out there, but you're going to need Python, so you might need to hire a Python developer. So that is where my next step comes in, which is, do we really need to go down this road? Because there are significant ramifications of starting to do customizations. So let's go look at that. So if development is needed, it's super important to discuss the impact with the customer, because the customer may be saying, this is a deal breaker. We have to do this. But they don't understand the ramifications of what that means long term. So you need to walk the customer through, the default workflow, and even, using Studio, maybe adding a field here or an automation there. And if they're still, no, we have to do this the way we want it, you need to make sure that they understand that there's going to be significant upfront development cost, significant testing and verification cost, some significant effort to get it deployed because you're now working in staging and live, future maintenance costs to maintain that code, and when they're migrating to a new version of Odoo, you're going to need to plan and test those customizations again. And so the way I like to think of it is, let's imagine that this customization is going to take 10 hours, right? So maintaining it over the next year might take another 10 hours, which isn't that significant, right? I mean, that's just double. But then redeploying that to the next version, I would say, is at least another 10 hours, because you've got to go do a staging branch in the new version, test it, have the customer test it, and do all those things. The other important part of that conversation is the customer needs to know that they're going to be going into staging and testing functionality and making sure it's working before they approve it to move into live. And that there is a delay in doing that, especially so if they've gotten used to Studio and Studio functionality, all of a sudden it doesn't work that way when you're doing development in custom, in staging, that you've got to take time to deploy to staging, and there's downtime involved there, things like that need to be planned for. So all of this needs to be a conversation with the customer before you go down this road. And this is why an important part of best practices is really, really thinking about, do we need these customizations? And you might not in Odoo. One of the best ways to define this is to walk the customer through. Well, we could do it this way. This is the default. This is what a minor customization looks like, adding a field, and then again, walking them through, what a customization looks like, and some examples of that, right? Redesigning, the example I showed here is redesigning how quotes are entered, changing the quote UI, changing how users search or interact with quotes, things like that are kind of a great way to have that conversation. All right. So once you've done all of this, then before you actually start to do implementation, you want to flowchart all of it, all of the decisions around where things are going to be where things aren't going to be customized, what modules are going to be used, where things are going to be customized minimally using Studio, and where things are going to be customized significantly. So that then you can come up with more of a quote around, the time needed for that, and then you can plan the next step, which is configuration. And we will talk about that in our next video.